This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. It'll be the basis of the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on Sunday, February 2, 2025. It's part of our series called This is the Way, the Path of Following Jesus. So let's hear the text from the 2020 revision of the New American Standard Bible. I'll be starting at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander, and like newborn babies long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation, if you have tasted the kindness of the Lord. And coming to him as a living stone, which has been rejected by people, but is choice and precious in the sight of God, you also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I am laying in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and the one who believes in him will not be put to shame. This precious value then is for you who believe, but for unbelievers, a stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. For they stumble because they are disobedient to the word, and to this they were also appointed. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For you were once not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. This is arguably probably the most well-known passage in Peter's first letter, and it's worthy of exploring it in some detail. Although I'm going to focus in the sermon on the early verses in this passage, the entire text is so rich and meaningful for us. Let's just begin by looking at the first three verses, growing in salvation. Now, Peter's first letter is written to the Christian communities of Asia Minor. Asia Minor is in Turkey today, and those communities are both Jewish and Gentile. And the themes of 1 Peter are complex and powerful. Believers in Jesus, as Peter might describe them, are like exiles and pilgrims as they make their way in a hostile world. So the letter is not so much about persecution as it is about embracing the reality of the world in which they live in. So this is an important text to those churches in Asia Minor, the very same churches that the Apostle Paul moved through in his missionary journeys. These are the churches to whom Peter is writing. Now, every time I pick up 1 Peter, I go back to when I was in college, and in my second year of Greek in college, we had to translate all of 1 Peter. So every time I spend time here, it takes me back to what it was like translating this book out of Greek into English. It's super difficult since Peter's style and his grammar are non-conventional, and you'll see a few pieces of that even in today's podcast. Peter, rather than using like active verbs when he writes, he uses a lot of participles. And what that does is it makes the teaching in 1 Peter kind of chained or linked together. Imagine a chain with a bunch of links in it, one attached to the other. And he'll often list things or characteristics, but he does so in a way that is rich and meaningful and uses a rather unique vocabulary. It's deeply meaningful. All that's to say is when you pick up 1 Peter in English, it may not seem like it, but it is so different from many of the other books of the New Testament. It really is unique and powerful. So his exhortation begins in verse 1. with a strange listing of vices to avoid. He tells his readers to avoid malice, which, at least in terms of what this word means here, it's an evil action taken toward another. He says to avoid deceit, which is evil intent toward another. Often, of course, unrealized action. So the difference between malice and deceit: malice is the evil you do, deceit's the evil you think about. Then there's hypocrisy, which is hiding or concealing evil intent or action. So you might have malice or deceit, but you simply don't display them easily and hide behind a facade or an appearance of something you're not. Then he says to avoid envy, which is evil born of scarcity and wanting, that you want what other people have. And then finally, to avoid slander, which is an evil directed at demeaning others. All 5 of these practices or behaviors are really about the ways in which we think and act toward other individuals. So Peter's core exhortation is then about how Christians live in a hostile world. In this case, he begins by telling believers what they're not to do in verse 1. Then he goes on in verse 2, and he says, like newborn babes. Now, when we read that, sometimes we might think of how we've heard that in other places in the New Testament. Now, this is not Peter's judgment on the development of those he's writing to. In other words, he doesn't think they're developmentally like babies. And this becomes easily confusing for us because both Paul and the writer of Hebrews use this same kind of language about the milk that's required for them to describe their immaturity in spiritual things or immaturity in Christ. So take care not to bring the meaning of what Paul and the writer of Hebrews say when it comes to newborn babies and the milk that we're going to talk about in a moment. Remember, he started out by saying in verse 2, like newborn babes. Here is an encouragement. He's encouraging us to be like these newborn babes. It's not intended as a rebuke. But then he says that like newborn babes, we're to long for the pure milk of the word. Now, there's lots made of this idea of the pure milk. And the best way we can understand it is in the context of 1 Peter is around newborn babes. As a newborn needs that milk for life, so do we. And the idea here is that it's the pure milk of the word. And what is that word? It's, of course, Jesus, the life and teaching of Jesus. So the idea as we move through this text is to not lose the notion of longing. Notice what he said, like newborn babes, long for the pure milk of the word. That longing is a strange word here. It doesn't occur in a lot of places in the New Testament. It has to do with this expression of kind of deep, almost primal survival. But what's this word for, this pure milk of the word? It is for a purpose, and he says what it is. It's to grow in respect to salvation. So we long for the, quote, milk, the metaphor, which is the word, to grow in salvation. So we have to be careful, though. This is not exclusively about growing in knowledge or information. Remember, it's about how we're formed for behavior. Remember, what did he tell them in verse 1 not to do? Those all had to do with kind of intentionality and behavior. So we would understand then that to long for the pure milk of the word and grow in respect to salvation is kind of its opposite. All right, so this isn't about information. This is about formation. Then he puts a qualifier on the end at verse 3. He says, if you have tasted the kindness of the Lord. The qualifier is that those who have experienced the kindness of the Lord will long for this word that grows in respect to salvation. And the metaphor, of course, Peter uses is like newborn babes long for the pure milk. If we know the Lord, we will long for this pure milk of the word. That opens a key passageway to us, our first one, that disciples are insatiable about their growth in salvation. Disciples are insatiable about their growth in salvation. The words Peter uses here are conveying a very clear truth, and it's very kind of image-rich language. Those who have tasted the kindness of God, that's the qualifier at the end of verse 3, live a life of insatiable longing for God. When we consider our lives, we need to hear Peter and what the Lord is saying here in 1 Peter just as much as the people he wrote this to. Insatiable longing, like a newborn for milk. This is the kind of desire we need for Christ and growth in him. So the question we hold is, how is that happening in our life every day? We turn to the middle section of this text, verses 4 to 8, and we're going to move away slightly from the theme of growing in salvation to talk about how we grow together. Now, Peter elaborates on the importance of this longing for growth, and he does so because we have a larger purpose in it. And so in comes a new metaphor. If you sit down and read 1 Peter, he uses metaphor after metaphor after metaphor. So the new metaphor is now not babes and milk, but rather it is a building made of stones. And he writes that we're to come to him as a living stone. Now, this isn't us as a living stone yet. This is Jesus. And this is an example of Peter's writing style. See, there's no active verb here. It says, and coming to him as a living stone. That word coming is a participle. It's not a verb per se. And so the idea here is that Peter's kind of chaining together ideas, kind of leading you sequentially from one thing to the next to the next. So the idea is that you're to be like newborn babes, longing for the pure milk of the word, leading to salvation, and coming to him as a living stone. So the metaphor changes, but don't let the metaphor throw you. The process is linked together. So the text is not pointing to us as living stones yet. The living stone he's talking about here is Jesus. He's the first of these living stones. He says that he is choice. In other words, he's peculiar, and precious, which can also mean like unique. There's no one else like this living stone. So imagine a building being built out of stones, but instead of being built out of inanimate rocks, it's built metaphorically out of people, with Jesus being the peculiar, unique, the choice and precious one in that. So we'll learn in a moment that this Jesus is, as a living stone, is also the key chief cornerstone of this new building. Then Peter talks about the rest of the Christian community. He says that we're living stones too, and that we're being built up. Again, it's in the metaphor of being built up, one stone being stacked upon another, fitted together with the stones around it, so that we're all being used as living stones, building something up. So we're part of the building in which Jesus is the very key of it. The idea is that we're not dead, inanimate objects in the work that God is doing, but we're real, we're living, and that our way of life and the way in which we hold our faith, at least for the sake of the Christians Peter's writing to, is being rejected by people. So this is familiar for Peter's audience. There's a lot of building, a lot of blocks. He's using a metaphor that everybody would know. It's a metaphor to speak of what the church is in the world. We're a community made out of living stones. For what purpose? Well, he kind of gives us a hint where he's going, which will be down in verses 9 and 10, but he names here that there's this royal priesthood going on. And this royal priesthood will appear, of course, again in a few verses, but it's grounded in what we read in the book of Exodus, chapter 19. Now, kings and priests are usually separate things. They're not the same thing. And so what's unusual here is that he combines it together in much the same way Exodus 19 does. In our case, we are one and the same as part of this building of which Jesus is the chief cornerstone. And so we are to offer our sacrifices to God through Jesus. Well, in this new building, we don't offer animal sacrifices, which then again are dead sacrifices. We offer living sacrifices, our worship, our praise. There's no animals dying here. We're living stones in a building. Remember, during the time this is written, Christians have no buildings. They have no edifice anywhere. They meet in homes. So the notion of the church being its people is important, and it's grounded right here in 1 Peter, that the church is not a building, the church is its people. Peter then explores 3 different texts which speak of this reality of the building God is erecting. Isaiah 28, verse 16 is the first passage Peter quotes. He talks about how God is building a new house with a choice stone. Remember, it's the same word that we read above about the description of Jesus as a living stone. And that belief in this stone, again, staying in the metaphor, the stone being Jesus, that person will not be put to shame. So the text is telling us that God has made a way and that we're offered a choice. The one who believes will not be put to shame. That's the choice. Thus, that stone has value for those who believe, and it has value for those who do not believe, because it forces a choice. And that takes us to the next quotation Peter uses from Psalm 118, verse 22. He says, "But in this choice, the builders rejected the stone." Their rejection was actually a means of making Jesus the chief cornerstone. And this is kind of the tongue-in-cheek way that the Apostle Paul preaches this, and also how Peter uses it as well. That it was the very rejection of Jesus is the thing that gave him his position as the chief cornerstone. The builders rejected the stone. Of course, the builders being the establishment of Jesus' day, the Jewish religious leaders combined with the Romans. Again, it still points back to choice. While people choose to either accept or reject, what doesn't change here is how God's purpose is not stopped. Whether rejected or not, God's purpose is accomplished. And then that takes us to the third quotation Peter reaches to, which is Isaiah 8:12. Back to Isaiah again to tell us that this stone of Jesus can be stumbled on or offend us. It's counterintuitive. And here's what I mean by that. It's not so much about the judgment that comes our way, but about the choice we're offered. We can stumble or be offended at Jesus. That's part of our choice. So Peter adds his own editorial piece here that their choice then was disobedience. The people who chose to reject him. And this is where they're appointed. It's all a key passageway for us. Growth in salvation is part of God's larger work in the world. Let me say it again. Growth in salvation is part of God's larger work in the world. If we step back just a bit from this metaphor, just back away a little bit from this living stones in a building, we can begin to see that God is working for something. Our life as a single stone doesn't have as much meaning as it will as part of a larger purpose with other believers to do something. That God's building something and we're part of that. Well, what is that? Well, we know that God is working to save this world, and that work happens through us. It's not quite volunteering. It's God working through us. So Christ being formed in us, in other words, as we become these living stones, we do the work that Christ has given us together. So there's more at stake in our spiritual growth than just ourselves. The purpose of God in the world depends on it. Let's conclude with verses 9 and 10 that focus on growing in God's purpose. This is perhaps, of course, one of the most better known passages in 1 Peter. Peter leans into more metaphors as he tries to describe these people or stones who have a purpose. And so he turns to Exodus 19, as we mentioned a few moments ago when he talked about royal priesthood. That's grounded in Exodus 19. So we go there once more to describe the kind of people God is building, or what God is building out of people. He gives 4 descriptions. The first one, that we're a chosen people, that believers are to carry out God's purpose in the world. We've been chosen by God for a purpose. Second, that we're a royal priesthood. We mediate the grace of God's glory each day. Priests mediate things, and that's our job as the royal priesthood, is to mediate the lordship of Jesus Christ, God's glory each day. Third, Peter describes us as a holy nation, and the idea here is to convey citizenship. Before we're anything else, we're God's people. And the fourth one, people for God's own possession, is an affirmation that we belong to God alone, that God possesses us. Now, in many respects, what we're hearing here in Exodus 19, all of these promises were given to the nation of Israel, a chosen people, royal priesthood, holy nation, people for God's own possession. And what Peter's trying to tell us is that the church, the community of believers, is now in many ways the new Israel, inheriting its promises, not contrary to Israel, but in a way, a fulfillment of it. So what are we to do? He says very clearly that we're to proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness, which is paganism, into his marvelous light, salvation. Again, more metaphor, dark and light. Speaking straight into the Gentile context that Peter's speaking to. He's saying that you used to not be a people, but now are. That's back to the whole idea that if the Jews are the chosen people, the Gentiles are not. Peter's trying to say the door is open to Jews and Gentiles. We used to not be God's people, but now we are. Then he says, you used to be excluded from mercy, but now we're included. Same idea, repeated, that we're now part of this new community. It all ties together in another key passageway for us. And it's this, that the community of the church is God's saving proclamation to the world. It's hard to accept this truth, to be honest. What Israel was before Jesus, we have now become. First among that work is that we're to be a group who proclaim the excellencies of him who called us. Our work of growing in faith is so that we might be a witness to God's greatness. Such a great narrative in these 10 verses, taking us from the kind of behaviors we need to leave behind, and instead we need to be like newborn babies, longing for the pure milk of the word. Why? Because God is building us into something that is a witness to this world of his love, his grace, his saving power, his judgment, his justice, all those things. God is using his church to proclaim salvation available to all. If you have comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you. Please visit my website at revcraig.com. Click on News in the upper right-hand corner, and then on the drop-down menu, you'll see the word Podcast. Click on that, and click on this week's episode and leave a comment. I also encourage you to visit our church's website, ffmc.org, to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.